What's up, everybody? It's your boy True Wolf God, and welcome back to another video. Hope you're having a good day, being safe, and all the other good stuff. Let's get into it. Damn.
Everybody knows that I love horror games, but one of the scariest types of enemies used in a lot of the biggest franchises out there are Stalker enemies. Stalker enemies have been around for a really long time now, even before Nemesis made them famous in Resident Evil 3. In fact, some horror game franchises out there have literally built their entire series around Stalker enemies. Which brings me to today's episode of Nerdspace Games as I give you guys my list of horror game franchises that are known for their stalkers. Before we get started though, know that since we are talking about horror game franchises, I'll only be including entries on this list that feature at least 2 games in their respective series. This means no Alien Isolation or Hunting Ground. But if you're a fan of stalker enemies and horror games, be sure to check those 2 games out as they are definitely some of the best out there. Oh, by the way, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 horror game franchises with the best stalker enemies. Let's get it. Number 10, Silent Hill. Surprisingly, Silent Hill isn't exactly known for being a horror franchise that is built around stalker enemies. That's because stalker enemies in the Silent Hill franchise are nowhere near as unpredictable as other games on today's list. With that being said, Silent Hill still has a few stalker enemies that stand out. Probably the most famous stalker enemy of Silent Hill is Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2 and its...
Before we keep on going, anybody in the comments can tell me why is Pyramid Head so small in this one when he's supposed to be 7 foot? I don't get it.
Remake Pyramid Head stalks the main character James Sunderland throughout Silent Hill for a majority of the game. From the first time that we see Pyramid Head staring at us from across the hallway to the jump scares that he gets us with when he attacks James, Pyramid Head is one of the scariest parts of Silent Hill 2. Sure, he might not be your traditional stalker enemy thanks to him mostly showing up following a cutscene, but he's still one of the most iconic stalker enemies out there. Another Silent Hill stalker enemy that deserves a quick shout out is Walter Sullivan. Unlike Pyramid Head, Walter feels less predictable thanks to him following the player through multiple doors and multiple worlds of Silent Hill 4: The Room. And there's even more stalker enemies within the franchise, though none of them are as famous as Pyramid Head. For example, you have Stalker Head in Silent Hill The Short Message, as well as the Ghost in Silent Hill 4: The Room. Number 9, Dead Space. When it comes to Dead Space, there are 2 specific stalker-like enemies that I want to focus on. The first is in the original Dead Space and its remake, the Hunter. The Hunter is first introduced after Isaac encounters a strange doctor that has been performing experiments on the necromorphs. This ultimately led to the creation of the abomination known as the Hunter. Unlike other necromorphs, this alien creature continues to heal itself, basically making it indestructible. Great, as if these things weren't a pain in the ass already. Thankfully, you could slow the Hunter down by dismembering it or using your status powers to slow it down while you get away. The other type of enemies that I want to address, although not really your traditional stalker-like enemies, are ironically named the Stalkers. These necromorphs are different from the traditional alien creatures Isaac encounters, and you first see them in Dead Space 2. Here they hunt in packs and chase after Isaac before striking at the right moment. While they are able to be killed, unlike the Hunter in the original game, stalkers keep the player on their toes by showing up in packs to, well, to stalk their prey.
That'd be interesting when they do a remake of that one.
Number 8, The Evil Within. On paper, the Evil Within franchise is a horror game series that you wouldn't think about when considering horror franchises for a list like this. But when you think about it carefully, you'll notice that The Evil Within actually has some pretty intense and intimidating stalker enemies.
They do. They really do. You know, especially that one. That one's annoying. But I love it too at the same time. I love Evil Within. I ain't gonna lie to you. It's one of my favorite games. One of my favorite horror games is The Evil Within. I had so much fun playing it.
My personal favorite is Reborn lore from the first game, with one of the creepiest introductions in the form of a screaming spider girl rising from a puddle of blood. Lore immediately puts fear into any player experiencing this game for the first time. Looking at the second game though, you have what some people would argue as the scariest stalker enemy of the franchise, Anima. This is one of the most unique stalker enemies ever, as she's a creature that you could technically never encounter if you don't activate her in one of her predetermined locations of the Evil Within 2. If you do run into her though, well, be prepared for one of the creepiest moments of the series, as you'll have to avoid this spirit-like creature as she sings and searches for Sebastian on multiple occasions.
I remember this. I remember this. Yup. She is
Number 7,
scary.
Slender. Ever since 2012, Slender Man has been stalking players throughout multiple games within the Slender franchise. As a pale, faceless character that literally stalks the player from a distance and slowly moves towards them, Slender Man is the perfect example of less being more. That's because unlike most of the stalker enemies on today's list, Slender Man literally doesn't really do much. He relies mostly on his jump scares and presence to terrify the player into making terrible mistakes that lead to a game over. As for which Slender game stands out to me the most, that title goes to Slender: The Arrival. Unfortunately, most of the Slender games nowadays are not as scary to the modern audience, as it's essentially a basic but creepy premise.
Yeah.
Slenderman slowly follows you and pops up every now and then, and if you look at him for too long, it's game over. Slender: The Arrival ups the ante though, with the most intimidating and aggressive Slenderman we've seen thus far. True, it's not as innovative as Slender the 8 Pages was back in 2012, but it's the best modern use of the character in a way that keeps the player on their toes. I personally prefer Slender: The Arrival over every other entry due to the atmospheric core, terrifying enemies, and the story, which is something that's usually missing from the Slenderman games. Regardless of which Slenderman game you prefer though, you have to admit that he's one of the scariest stalker enemies out there, and his franchise definitely earns itself a spot on today's list.
I'll definitely try this out. I haven't played that one.
Number 6, Fatal Frame.
But I do agree when he says some Slenderman stories do not have story to them. Most of them don't. Most of them just you walking and grabbing pages and then get jump scared and stuff like that. Most of them don't really have that big of a story to them. So that one he said does, sort of. So it'd be nice to try that one out.
Through the endless void of horror games featuring stalker enemies within my mind, Fatal Frame wasn't a franchise that clicked with me as one that is famous for its stalker enemies. However, after replaying the first 2 Fatal Frame games recently, I'm actually reminded of the fact that usually the main villains of each Fatal Frame game are in the form of a stalker enemy. And some pretty terrifying stalker enemies at that. Looking at the first game, you have Kyrie Humura, the Rope Shrine Maiden. As she was part of a failed ritual, Kyrie has returned as a corrupted, vengeful spirit that curses anybody that enters Humura Mansion. This includes the main protagonist of the game, Miku, who the player controls for a majority of the game. As the last Rope Shrine Maiden, Kyrie chases Miku throughout the mansion with ropes surrounding her, in which she ultimately uses to torture her target in the same way that she was killed. Since she can't be killed, each time the Kyrie pops up, Miku has to outrun her. Now, most of the time, Kyrie is supposed to catch Miku in order for the story to proceed, but there are some circumstances in which the player could get a game over if they fail to escape Kyrie. In the sequel, Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly, we see one of my personal favorite stalker enemies in a horror game, Sai. Just like Kyrie, Sai was part of a failed ritual, but in a completely different village. However, Sai is much more terrifying than Kyrie for a couple of reasons. For one, she actually feels more like a traditional stalker enemy, as the moments that she shows up being caught by her leads to instant death. Also, she has a terrifying laugh and a sinister smile as she chases the player. Between these 2 stalker enemies alone, Fatal Frame deserves a spot on today's list. However, to some extent, a lot of the ghosts in the Fatal Frame series could be considered a stalker enemy on their own, as they continue to appear multiple times throughout their respective games despite the player killing them with their camera. The Broken Neck Woman and Kiryu twins of Fatal Frame 2 are 2 perfect examples of ghosts that continue to stalk the player throughout the game, regardless of how many times they are killed.
Interesting.
Number 5, Remothered. While only having 2 games, the Remothered franchise is easily one of the best series when it comes to the stalker enemies. Looking at the first game, you have not one, but multiple iconic stalkers scattered throughout the manor. The first one you come across is Richard Felton, the head of the Felton Manor, who the main character believes to be hiding a dark secret. In the first section of the game, he chases Rosemary through the hiding a... First one you come across is Richard Felton, the head of the Felton Manor, who the main character believes to be hiding a dark secret. In the first section of the game, he chases Rosemary through the dark, in which the player will need to hide, avoid, and distract him in order to safely get away from him. If caught without a counter item, it's basically game over. Richard is not the only stalker enemy of the game though. In fact, there's 2 others that are much more terrifying and iconic than he is. First, you have Jennifer. Without diving too much into her backstory because of, spoilers, Jennifer is probably the most unsettling stalker of the game. Because of the way her hair covers her face, the way she walks and chases the player, and the loud and screeching screams that she does, Jennifer will definitely be one of the scariest parts of Remothered Tormented Fathers. Yet, the most iconic stalker enemy of the franchise though is the Red Nun. Again, without diving into spoiler territory, the Red Nun has one of the most terrifying soundtracks when she locates the player, and she's easily the hardest stalker enemy to avoid thanks to her speed.
I remember this. I do remember that little bust through. I remember that. Alright, she gets like grabbed or something.
Broken Porcelain, the sequel to Tormented Fathers, also has its fair share of stalker enemies, and while they are nowhere near as iconic as the ones that we encountered in the first game, the improved mechanics of Broken Porcelain does make the experience a little more enjoyable in terms of the gameplay side of things.
Okay.
Number 4, Clock Tower. While Clock Tower officially has 3 mainline entries, it's the first and third entries that's worth noting, as these two are the ones that really capture the essence of a good stalker enemy horror game. In the first game, you have the infamous Scissors Man chasing you around the clock tower. While the gameplay mechanics are pretty outdated thanks to it being a point-and-click horror game, the atmospheric horror is actually top-notch thanks to the constant presence of the Scissors Man. Throughout the game, Scissors Man will pop up when you least expect it. Whether it's from a box that you are about to search, a bathtub in which you find a dead body, or literally him jumping through a window, you never know when he might show up next. And when he does show up, you better react quickly or you'll instantly become his next victim. In Clock Tower 3 though, you have more stalker enemies, improved mechanics, and overall a better game as a whole. In fact, I would say that Clock Tower 3 kind of reminds me a lot of Haunting Ground. There's actually plenty of stalker enemies in this game alone. You have the siblings, Gemina and Ralph, who wield the iconic weapon of the series, giant scissors. You have one stalker wielding a sledgehammer and another wielding 2 axes. But let's not forget about the spirits as well, which are ghosts that chase the player, and if they catch you without a stone to counter them, they'll break you in half. Literally.
Ooh.
Overall, the franchise was basically built on the stalker enemy mechanic, and fun fact, Scissors Man in the original Clock Tower was the first traditional stalker enemy seen in a horror game. Yeah, he even beats out stalkers like Mr. X and Nemesis.
Crazy. That's so crazy. I didn't know that.
Number 3, Amnesia. Another horror game franchise that's
I know this
completely
game.
built on the stalker enemy mechanic is the Amnesia series. From the very start of the franchise, we encounter not one but multiple stalker enemies in the Dark Descent. With that being said, Amnesia uses the stalker enemy mechanic in various ways throughout the franchise. For example, the first 3 games focus less on a single stalker enemy, but rather an army of them. This is somewhat similar to the way this mechanic is used in Outlast, just minus the lead stalkers of the game like Chris Walker and the Demon. Instead, the first 3 games each choose a different type of enemy or creature to act as a group of stalker enemies chasing the main character. In the first game, you have the Gatherers. These guys are definitely some of the most terrifying enemies you'll ever encounter in a horror game. While they were all once people, the Gatherers have been experimented on so much so that they have become empty shells of their former selves.
Backhand's
They
crazy.
are also unique stalker enemies compared to others in this franchise due to the effect that they have on the main character's sanity if the player stares at them for too long. Then, a machine for pigs, you have probably the least scariest stalker enemies of the franchise, the man pigs. As the name suggests, these creatures are essentially created by a machine that combines the genetics of man and pig together in order to create an army for the main villain of the game to control.
I know this one because that's the one I beat during stream, but the videos are not on my channel anymore, sadly.
Finally, you have the Harvesters in Amnesia Rebirth. The Harvesters are undead creatures that, like the Gatherers, were once human but are now puppets to the main villain of the game. They resemble ghoul-like creatures, and they have some similarities to the Gatherers seen in the first game. Now there is a 4th game of the Amnesia series, which is honestly my personal favorite of the franchise. That of course being Amnesia the Bunker. However, this game is probably the most different from the previous entries of the series as it dives more into survival horror gameplay mechanics. And instead of dealing with an army of stalker enemies, you have one, the Beast. Also known as the Demon, the Monster, and even the Stalker, the Beast serves as the main antagonist of the bunker. While there are some other enemies in the bunker, the Beast is what the player will be forced to deal with for just about the entire game. The player will need to manage their weapons to keep this indestructible beast at bay, their oil to keep the lights on and keep the beast away, and healing items to prevent a game over. While not as clever as Alien Isolation's Xenomorph, the Beast definitely stands out as one of the best stalker enemies in horror games. Number 2, Alice. You
Oh,
could probably make up a
1000%.
full list of Stalker enemies on the Alice series alone. That's
Mhm.
because between the 3 games of the series, there's more than 10 terrifying Stalker enemies that haunt our dreams to this day. Now, I won't be jumping too much into the Alice trials, mostly because I don't think I played it enough to give you guys my honest thoughts about the Stalker enemies in that game. But just know that the Alice Trials is basically Dead by Daylight, but with AI controlled stalkers instead of the asymmetrical gameplay that Dead by Daylight has.
Mhm.
Still, even ignoring the stalkers of the 3rd entry of the series, Alice 1 and 2 still has its fair share of stalker enemies that'll keep you up at
1000%.
night. My personal favorite, and the one that I find the scariest, is Chris
Hello,
Walker.
little pig.
From the very start of the game, Chris Walker is one of the first deadly faces that Miles, the
So
main
he says
character
it's like
of
a
the
game.
first Alice game, encounters when searching the Mount Massive Asylum. His big and muscular appearance and terrifying face is enough to creep all of us out. But add in the jump scares, the fact that he keeps calling us Little Piggy, and the soundtrack that plays when he's chasing you, and you'll pretty much learn early on why I believe he's one of the scariest stalker enemies out there.
1000%.
Little pig.
I know I said it wrong, but like, it's true.
Let's try to wrap things up quickly on this series though, because there's a long list of stalker enemies to talk about.
Other things I will say too is I do want to do a tier list of enemies on this game because I think it'll be fun to do.
You have Traeger, the self-proclaimed doctor that chases you with a pair of shears, wearing nothing but an apron. The Demon, a demonic-looking creature that haunts Blake's flashback sequences in a school during the events of Outlast 2. Marta, the hooded religious follower of Noth that wields a giant pickaxe that she uses to perform some truly horrifying death animations.
Oh, 1000%.
And let's not forget about the patience of Mount Massive in the first game and the cult members of Outlast 2, as each of them act as a stalker enemy that you can't kill either. Number 1, Resident Evil. Obviously, Resident Evil claims the #1 spot for best horror game franchise with the best stalker enemies. I mean, I was able to do a whole ranking video on the stalker enemies of Resident Evil, and a majority of those entries were phenomenal stalker enemies. Sure, Resident Evil wasn't the franchise that first introduced stalker enemies, but it was definitely made famous with Mr. X and more importantly, Nemesis. Hell, when people think about the concept of a stalker enemy, probably the most recognizable name that comes to mind is Nemesis. And yeah, I get that unlike franchises like Amnesia or Outlast, that Resident Evil isn't exactly built completely around the stalker enemy mechanic, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that the Resident Evil series has a lot of incredible and iconic stalker enemies. Let's just break a few of them down. Starting with the granddaddy of stalker enemies, you have Nemesis. Honestly, it's because of Nemesis why the concept of stalker enemies have become so famous. The constant presence of Nemesis throughout Resident Evil 3 always kept us on our toes. The dude would literally jump through a window, shoot rockets at you, and show up at the most inconvenient time. Then you have Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7. While not as iconic as Nemesis, the argument could be made that it was Jack Baker that revived the stalker enemy mechanic in the Resident Evil franchise today. After Nemesis, we don't really see any good stalker enemies until we get Jack Baker in RE7, and man did he really deliver. Whereas Nemesis could only say stars, which is badass of course, Jack Baker on the other hand could taunt Ethan as he chased him throughout the Baker estate. Other shoutouts include Lady Dimitrescu and Village, Chief Mendez and Basanta in Resident Evil 4 Remake, more specifically the Separate Ways DLC, and even some of the lesser known stalkers like the Leechman and Al Lester and Outbreak. Yet the stalker enemy that I view as the best and most intimidating stalker of the franchise is Mr. X in the remake of Resident Evil 2. While the dude is in the original game, he's hidden behind a second scenario that a lot of gamers missed out on. Plus, he's not that intimidating in the original, and he's very scripted. Fast forward to the remake, and you get the most unpredictable and scariest stalker enemy of Resident Evil.
It do be
But
popping
that
out of
does it
nowhere.
for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Resident Evil the best horror game franchise featuring the best stalker enemies, or is there a different horror franchise that deserves that title? Let me know down below. Oh, and don't forget to hit up the comments with any other horror game franchises that feature stalker enemies. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But
Okay. Well, in my opinion, okay, the best stalker enemies will be in. See, yeah, I think that is hard of a decision. But I don't know, cause like when it comes to stalker enemies, I think Amnesia does got some really good ones, but I ain't gonna lie to you. I think Outlast is the best because of how many jump scares you get through. You get a lot of jump scares. Also, the enemies that you see come back all the time. Like you don't kill them. Well, no, because you do kill the doctor, and then the one that calls you little pig does die at the end of the first game. But he comes back in this and the DLC, and that's Whistleblower. Um, and you got some good ones in Whistleblower too. So to be honest, I don't know for like the only one I really know of in Resident Evil is Nemesis and and this guy. And then you get Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8, whatever how her name is, to be honest with you. And yeah, she was cool and everything, but never anything like on their level. Same with everybody else. I think Nemesis is the only one I really liked a lot. Um, but when you come to the characters in here, I think I liked every character. They all was very scary. They all had me, you know, on the edge of my seats, on the edge of my seat all the time. Um, I was scared when I was playing the game. When it comes to when it comes to Resident Evil, I'm not really scared. Like I had like a lot of jump scares when it comes to zombies, though. Like the zombies are more. I was more scared of the zombies. I'm more irritated and frustrated with this one right here because he kept on coming back and it was really annoying. I ain't gonna lie to you, because he came back not at like the bad times, really, not really that like crazy time. Like when he came back, it was pretty easy to run away from him. I wasn't like, oh shit, I can't run away from him type stuff, but it was more like, oh shit, here he goes again. But like when I was playing it, I mostly at the end, at the end of the game, it was so annoying that I almost quit the game. Dead serious, because I was playing on one of the hardest difficulties as well. So mind you, I was playing on one of the hard difficulties, so I barely had any loot or anything. But other than that, let me stop yapping. I'll see y'all later. Much love to y'all. Be safe. Have a good rest of y'all day. Resident Evil is no. My choice is Outlast. Outlast is my choice as best stalker enemies. And yeah, don't forget to drop a like, drop a sub. Video will be linked in the description down below. So if you want to watch it, go ahead. Much love to all y'all. Peace out.